Hi, everyone. This is Barb Egan, and on today's Therapy Talks, we have Mariya Javed from Minneapolis, Minnesota, an addiction and trauma therapist who specializes in brain spotting. She is the director of behavioral health and works with a great team of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and other healthcare professionals to treat people in a holistic manner. We talk about what traditional talk therapy and CBT, what that approach looks like, and how she integrates an intensive program, how she focuses on racial trauma, and we really dive into brain spotting. What is it? How does it differ for EMDR therapy? Why it works? Great analogies to make it sit within you and how to tap into that. So I hope you join us. So, Mariya, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you live? Where do you practice?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Mariya Javed Payne. I am currently located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States, and um, I have two locations where I work. So I'm the director of behavioral health services at a federally qualified health center. So we have a team of mental health therapists, psychiatry, social workers, psychiatric nurses, and we're housed inside of a primary care center. So we're really treating community health with a ton of services packed into one place and like a public health center. And then I also have a private practice called Awaken Consulting Services. And that's where I do brain spotting trainings, brain spotting intensives for clients, and racial trauma coaching, and anti-racism coaching, and a whole lot of other things.
Wow, Mariya, that's amazing. So I lived just outside of Minneapolis. That's where I went to high school and grew up, and I was a hockey player in Faribault. Have you heard of
Oh,
that?
yeah. Yes, I have. It's not too far from here.
Yeah, I love Minneapolis. I love Minnesota. I miss it so much just being now on the West Coast and in Canada. But oh, that's fantastic. I love having you on just for that. And then obviously what you work in too. What amazing roles, like very leadership, addiction, trauma, brain spotting. These are all big topics that we can talk about, which are really fantastic. How did you get to where you are now as a therapist?
Mm. So my journey with going down this path, in high school, I wanted to be a psychologist, and wanted to go to New York University and move to New York and do that dream. But I've always been like the person that people would call to talk to and talk out their problems with, and I really like being with people. And really what moved me down the path of clinical social work and addiction counseling trauma is my own story. So I had been really addicted to drugs and alcohol in my teenage years, starting around age 13. I was an IV drug user. I got very, very addicted to opiates and um, cocaine, and smoked crack, and was just in a really um, terrible place for a long, long time, struggling with my own addiction and my own trauma history, and my own also history with being an immigrant, and how hard it is um, for someone to move from a different country and try to gain that sense of belonging. So as I've unpacked my own story, and I've done tons and tons of my own therapy and healing work, I really started to see where those roots were. So in 2010, I finally got sober, and I was 20 at the time, which is pretty early for a lot of people to, get clean. But I'd been to rehab 8 times, and was just in a really, really dark place. So I met I met some people, like right place, right time, that became mentors to me, and um, helped me not only with my own recovery and get started on that journey, but looking at school. I dropped out of college a couple of times because I just was so um, enmeshed with the addiction that I couldn't sustain going to school. Um, and so finally, when I was stable enough, I did go back um, to Augsburg University here in Minneapolis and decided to do social work. And I chose that lens because social work has a way of looking at society and people and the environment and people through many different lenses. So, not just the individual, but what's going on in their neighborhood, what's going on in society. So, I really liked that micro and macro approach. Um, Luckily, I've always kind of had a holistic curiosity about people. So, yeah, went down that, just, school for like 10 years. Got my bachelor's in social work. Then I went and did my addiction counseling certificate program, and became licensed as an LADC, and then went back and got my clinical master's level social work degree. I've done a ton of other certifications as well. So the mentor that I, worked with was like, you could really add a lot to the field because you have your own personal experience with addiction. And, you're already curious about being a therapist. So this might be a good entry point. And I'm glad it was. Because a lot of times going into the field, you're like, oh, I don't know what to work on and what's my niche and how do I, do this thing that I learned in school.
And translate it into real life and with real people. And you had that story, like you got it.
Yeah, I did. And it's such a interesting and compassionate like place to be when when you look at somebody and you're talking with them and they're sharing, those darknesses, and exactly what that's like. And you've been able to get through, to the other side, even if that means just a few steps ahead. Not everything is perfect. You're still, I was still figuring a lot of things out, but I had enough pieces where I could, give that back. And, counseling is giving and receiving, in my opinion, because it's a simultaneous experience where you're sharing and, coaching somebody, and it reinforces your own wisdom and knowledge and growth as well. So I know that sounds like cliche about, oh, I'm gonna, show other people, how to learn how to be sober. And it's, for my own recovery, but there was enough of a separation where I really learned a lot about letting people also have their path and their journey. And the spiritual piece too has been very, very important in my life. I was raised Muslim, and that was a challenging point of contention for me when I was growing up and trying to fit into the, American society. And so as I kind of grew up, I found other modalities and other forms of spirituality that I connected with. And, 8 rehabs later, I was still not successful with being sober. So the spiritual piece was a huge reason for me being able to stay sober. And some of the mentors I had were shamanic practitioners and had other indigenous ways of looking at things and practicing from that place of wisdom. And I'm just really grateful that I got a chance to be a part of that and continue to be a part of that. So that's a snippet of my story.
That's amazing. And so many people that I talk to, because often we're looked at as physical, emotional, mental, but spiritual beings too. And bringing that holistic approach, I think, can bring a lot of value for some people. And especially when there's like these inner workings, especially around trauma and addiction and that resilience that's birthed out of that. That's just what keeps coming to mind, like the resilience over and persistence. Now, with your story of going to rehab and that amount of times, do you find that common? Like with most people who come to see you or just work in, let's say, addiction field, the average time of going to rehab, what would you say that is?
Yeah, it's multiple. It's rarely just like one time.
Right, right.
Addiction it's a chronic brain patterning. So, um, and I have my own thoughts now, having 12 years of sobriety at this point, and being in the field and being in leadership, and building programs of like what is actually effective. And one of the things that I saw was missing in all of my treatments was there was no talk about trauma. I mean, it was really cognitive and changing patterns and CBT, and I suffered so much. I mean, so no one had like the depth of really looking at like, where does this come from? And that's a really westernized way of looking at things, which I think the individualist kind of approach versus collectivist. And um, much later I realized like, wow, there's so much more to the story of why I was so addicted. And I see that with many of my clients. And trauma and addiction to me they're married, they're together. I don't really believe you can have addiction without attachment disruption or trauma in the past, whether it may seem small, or a lot of people don't even know, like, hey, that was not a healthy thing for me to grow up with. They don't even know. So naming it is so important. But I think that the addiction field has a lot of work to do, and that's my hope, is to bring some drops of knowledge and wisdom around healing trauma and attachment wounds when treating addiction. I've never worked with a single person who had addiction who didn't have those concerns, whether they knew it or not.
So for someone hearing that maybe is struggling, let's say with substance misuse or abuse or addiction, and maybe that's a light bulb, maybe that's the first time they've heard something along the lines of addiction and trauma go hand in hand, they're married. I like that concept. What would you encourage them to do? Like, how could they get curious? Because you use that word too, which I love. How can they get curious about that to learn more?
Well, I think highlighting and providing the psychoeducation on addiction and attachment and trauma, and like the physiology, the neurophysiology of all of those things. Anytime I've explained that to my clients, their eyes kind of like widen, and it starts to make sense to them, and they start to orient, to those stories inside, that may not have had the name to it before. So I think that's really key, is starting with, sharing that awareness and seeing if it lands for them. Um, my approach is extremely conscientious of letting the client lead. So, I'm not there to stuff any of that down their throat. They really need to recognize that within themselves. But the curiosity piece is so important, is like, let's be curious about, where do you think the roots of the, addiction are? And, the urge to use a substance, or any urge that we have, is really an urge to shift out of one state of, being, like the way that you're feeling right now, and wanting to feel another way, usually self-soothing or better, feel better. So when you start to explain addiction, as a self-soothing, like a ritualized self-soothing behavior, it destigmatizes people, because who doesn't self-soothe? We all self-soothe. We're wired to self-soothe.
So let's say, when someone comes to see you, what are kind of the main things that they come in with? And then what does that process to work with you like? Because I'm intrigued. I personally think, and I'm a clinical supervisor with University of British Columbia. We get to mentor all sorts of graduate students all throughout the United States and Canada. It's such an honor. But what I find, it's not the graduate program, it's not the specific strategies necessarily, it's the person's story that makes them really a good therapist, really able to relate and be present with people. So what does that process when someone comes to see you, because already it just bleeds through, your story bleeds through in your heart for people, and trauma and brain spotting, like you said, and racial trauma. What does that look like when someone comes to see you, and what is that process like?
Yeah, so the format, like in my private practice, is intensives. And so the most of the people that are coming to work with me are folks who have been struggling for a long, long time, and maybe they've tried individual counseling, and they've tried lots of different therapists, and they haven't gained as much traction as they wanted to or needed to. So a lot of the folks that reach out are like, I need somebody to pull the splinter out, help me pull the splinter out. It hurts. I want to, I'll do whatever I need to do. I structure intensives like a retreat. So it's a really special and sacred time, and we plan it much in advance. And I do a 2-hour assessment with people who want to do this deeper work. And in that assessment, I'm not only gathering, their life history and the patterns, but I'm also assessing their nervous system, because intensives aren't for everybody. Not everyone can handle working, for 3 to 5 hours a day, up to a week at a time. So those are some of the things that I'm looking for is, how's the person responding to even having a 2-hour session? Because, the typical is about 60 minutes. And most of the clientele I see have been struggling with addiction. And the reason I think intensives work so well with addiction is that in our traditional either substance use treatment model or individual weekly therapy model, people they come for an hour, or they're there for 30 days, or they're there a couple of hours a day for outpatient therapy treatment, and then they leave. And then there's this entire time, a week later, an entire week in between, where they're at risk, for the triggers and the withdrawals and the problems, all the things that come with addiction. And so having a block of time where they're just immersed in going for the roots of their issues is a powerful thing. And we can get really far in deactivating or eliminating or reducing the cravings or the urges to use the substance, and then getting underneath, like, what's causing that, why. And that's usually related to, a lot of childhood trauma or attachment disruption. And so after we've taken that history and we've really assessed, like, what are your goals? I ask people to have, 2 or 3 goals that they really want to focus on. And we try to get through one of them throughout the time that we have. And then the other 2 are kind of bonuses, but we go where the client goes in the processing. And so a lot of times people are able to reduce the drivers, the emotional drivers that keep them stuck in the patterning, and break it apart enough so they're getting like a launch out into the world, 3, 4, 5 days later, and much less activated inside about things that are happening in their lives or world, because they're able to be in their bodies and embody themselves and access the resources that are inside as well. when we do this work, we're not just working on trauma, we're helping them come back home to themselves. The body is our home in this incarnation, in this physical realm that we're in. So when people begin to feel safe inside of their own skin, then they have a lot more choices and a lot more tools to work with to manage, the day-to-day difficulties. So I hope that makes sense.
That's complex and beautiful and creative. That's what sticks out to me is I love it. It's not, this 12-step program or this formula, because we're humans, we're not that. And that you really take time to do that process, invite the person involved into it, like the goals, because it's their life. And that's really empowering. That really sticks out to me. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Can you tell us a little bit about brain spotting?
Yeah, absolutely. How much time you got? Once I start talking about brain spotting, I get on a roll.
So maybe the overview of it, like what is it? Some of our listeners may not be familiar with it. They may, but what is it? What is it used for? What is the process of the treatment of utilizing brain spotting like? That if there's any take home exercises or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah, sure thing. So brain spotting is a type of psychotherapy that uses a neurophysiological approach. So it's a somatic based psychotherapy. And we like to call it a bottom up approach versus like talk therapy. Regular talk therapy is a top down approach. And what that means is that, a top down approach is really like frontal lobe, cognitive thinking, looking at our thoughts and then trying to get into the emotions and behaviors and alter them. A bottom up approach is using your sensory inputs. So all of our nerves in our body, our peripheral nerves go into our spine and then they go into our brainstem and then up into the subcortex, which is the midbrain. And so we actually start with really orienting to the physical, neurophysical experience of a problem. Some of my clients are kind of surprised when I say emotions are actually physical experiences. They're not separate. When you get angry, your, cheeks get red, your jaw clenches, your hands might get sweaty and clench into a fist, or your muscles in your legs might contract, or you might hold your breath. Same thing with fear, same thing with anxiety. And so this kind of Cartesian duality that we've had of separating mind and body is actually, I think at this point, shifting into recognizing that the body and the mind are housed in the same, same thing. And there's consciousness that's all together. So we go by connecting with the sensory and emotional and physical experience and, thoughts and memories and emotion, all of that's connected. And we work with orienting to that, noticing the sensations, and then, the brain is still one organ. And so the thoughts and, behaviors and patterns, those things start to emerge when we're doing this process. And it goes much deeper because the frontal lobe actually has very little talking. Language has very little to do with emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is a subcortical activity. So somatic psychotherapies reach for where emotions and trauma are actually held, which is subcortical. And then by processing that, emotional charge or energy, we then can shift the narrative and the language and the frontal lobe, decision making and, higher judgment patterning that way. So it's backwards. So that's sort of the underarching foundation of brain spotting. Brain spotting has a lot to do with the eyes and eye positions. So many people have heard of, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and that uses bilateral movement or bilateral eye movement. Brain spotting is different, where it uses fixed eye position. And so in a therapy session, we would be asking the person, whatever their issue is, and then asking them like, well, where do you notice that in your body or in or around your body? Not everyone feels everything in their bodies because there's so much neurodiversity in this world. And so we ask in a really open-ended way, what sensations, what are you noticing? What's your experience? And they might say, oh, I've got this, I'm having this relationship issue and my heart, hurts, and I have this tension in my heart. And then we would take a pointer, or there's many other techniques in brain spotting, but we use a pointer and we would scan that person's line of sight all the way across while they're noticing that pain in their heart area. And people will find that at a certain place or certain places that they feel or notice that sensation more strongly. And so that, when we fine tune and find exactly where that location is, that's what's called a brain spot. And theoretically, a brain spot is where the nerves, the peripheral nerves, all the nerves in your body going up into the brainstem and into the subcortical area of the brain, that's where the information of what you're experiencing is held. And eyes take us directly to that place. So when people feel that like, oh, it's more strong over here, or maybe it's more calm over here, we're locating the file, so to speak, of where it is in the brain, because this part of the brain, the optic nerve, goes directly into the limbic system, which is where all your emotional responses are held. It's where your motor coordination is. So, the sensory motor connection and memories and memory reconsolidation. The auditory, olfactory nerves are also meeting all in the subcortex. So, people remember, hear things, from the past, smell things, feel things. It's all going to the same place in the brain. And so once we've located that spot, there's a really, really deep level of attunement that the therapist is providing for that client. And the goal of the attunement is to create an environment of secure attachment. And many people didn't receive that, through their lifetime. So I'm really, really attuned to the person in front of me. And that can kind of seems to be like more of a buzzword now, but what is attunement? And attunement is being with in a really deep way with somebody's process without trying to like coerce them or be certain about what they're doing and what they're thinking, or me try to control what the process is, and allowing people to connect with the wisdom of their bodies and this, millennia old nervous system that we have that knows what to do. It knows how to heal. Innately, we all know how to heal if we're given the right resources and support and an environment that allows them to go there.
Right.
So I hope that explains a little bit about brain spotting.
And it's so fascinating because we've had on the show, and one of the other hosts, Haley Canigan, she does EMDR therapy. So we talk about that quite a lot. Most people that come on, especially trauma work, talk about EMDR therapy. So what is the big difference? I know you alluded to it, like the fixed eye positioning here with brain spotting and EMDR therapy. How would you know that one is better for you than the other?
Sure. I'm not an EMDR therapist, so I can't speak to all of the nuances of the therapy, but I've received it as a client, and I've received, both brain spotting and EMDR. The big differences that I would say are present are, like the fixed and the eye movement. And the theory behind a fixed eye position versus eye movement is that, let's say that, like, for example, I want you to imagine that there was a tiger in your office right now. Okay. So you're sitting there and there's a tiger and it's pacing back and forth in front of you. All right. And so that's that bilateral eye movement. And just notice kind of what happens in your body as you think about this, and your eyes are moving, you're probably tracking this tiger, right? The tiger is a metaphor for the threat or the trauma, because the trauma was a threat at some point in a person's life. All right. So you got that. I'm thinking about it right now. I'm like, oh God, if there's a tiger pacing in the room, be pretty anxious.
Yeah.
Like my muscle, like my shoulders are going into my ears.
My arms, yeah, like the back of like those tricep areas, I'm getting tight. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so that's part A. Part B is now I want you to imagine the tiger just sitting, focused, fixed in one spot.
Yeah.
Still anxiety producing, like there's a freaking tiger in your office, but where the threat is, and that it's not moving at this time.
Right.
So, even just notice the energy right now. Like I noticed like the vibe sort of just calmed a little as we shifted into the visual of the tiger laying down. So, if we translate that into like brain spotting and, EMDR, and I'll talk more about brain spotting because I really don't think that there's comparing, like, yes, the Western world really wants to compare, like what's the best thing, and tier it 1, 2, 3. And, the truth is all modalities have a place in this world and will help different people. But for brain spotting, the utilization of a fixed eye position, the theoretical underpinning of that is that the person knows where the threat is and it's in one location, because our bodies get activated with movement and proximity. So, if somebody's throwing a baseball, your body is going to engage physically to catch that baseball or, move away so it doesn't hit you or something like that. But if someone's just holding a baseball, you're going to be able to look at it and know, oh, it's right here. And I know where it is. I know that I'm here in comparison to the ball, and I'm relatively safe right now. So if we translate that into the brain spot being a trauma experience, which was a threatening experience at one point in a person's life, or may still be, they know where the threat is, and they know where they are, and they know where the therapist is kind of guarding the space. I imagine with EMDR, the eye movement, it does help processing, because bilateral stimulation is known to help with integrating, both sides of the brain and processing things and allowing for a rebalancing to happen. So I think it can be helpful, but I think it also can be really activating for the examples that I just gave.
That was fantastic. I have never heard it explained like that. And I've had in my clinic that I run, I've had both brain spotting therapists, EMDR therapists, and I've never heard it described like that. And I love that.
Yeah.
Like that was a visceral reaction when you really put that tiger, that threat there. And that made sense.
Yeah, thanks. I can't remember if that's from, I give credit to Peter Levine or David Grand, who's the developer of brain spotting, but yeah, I didn't come up with it myself, but I remember hearing it at one point, and it really made so much sense to me. So once we have this focused spot, the person can then start to go through the layers that are there because it's fixed. So the processing tends to be much, much deeper, because they're able to go, their brain is able to open the different layers of whatever the issue
very
is.
Focused. So in order to go deeper, let's say you've identified that spot, it's fixed. What strategies do you use to go deeper?
Inviting curiosity. So the goal really isn't to change anything. I'll say things like, just notice that or see where it takes you, and letting the client's brain travel where it needs to go to unpack whatever is there. Sometimes those memories can be, covered up or trapped or confused, things that you might not even think are related might come up. And so there's, epiphanies and insights that are happening along the way. The biggest thing though is the use of my body in the session. And my goal is to be fully grounded and fully present for what the person is experiencing in front of me. So at this point, doing counseling for about 12 years, there's not a whole lot that like freaks me out. I've had clients go into fetal position on the floor and go into like pre-verbal states of being in the womb. I've had people, look like they're having seizures, even though they weren't, but, shaking off and just shaking their bodies. And, angry, punching pillows, whatever. Like, I am there to help you release this in a healthy and safe way. And there's no judgment for the human experience. And so those are the truths that I'm embodying. And I can say that the only reason I can do that is because of the amount of my own healing work that I've done. The more, I encourage therapists. I work with a lot of therapists and certify a lot of therapists in brain spotting. And we really encourage people to do their own healing work, because it's a collective, experience. When a person does their healing work, they, just by being themselves and moving around in the world, are carrying that in their bodies. And it can, imbue whatever else you're doing, whatever you touch, whoever you're with, that energy and healing is inside of you.
Yeah, like you're saying, I think as humans, we co-regulate. So especially as a therapist, if you can be present with someone and you bring that calm, the invisibles going on between the two bodies, the two brains, it helps co-regulate someone's who is dysregulated or triggered. And so therefore it's so much that importance for us as therapists to do our own work, like you have, of really integrating your story with the mind and the body, is invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yes, the co-regulation, there's so much going on in the field between, two people in a session, that, the frame is open and there's so much that we don't even know is happening. But if you embody that state of being, it can help the person in ways, because when they were going through the trauma, they didn't have that.
Right.
So you're creating that anchoring in present time when they can sense that you're there and you're not judging and you're not afraid or trying to, make it go away or say that it's wrong, or all the other, insults that people receive when others around them don't know what to do. Yeah. How can you give what you don't have, right? How can you give something you don't have inside of you?
Right. You cannot give something you don't have. You're right. So if someone hears this and they're thinking, wow, this sounds powerful, I'm curious, I want to learn more, would brain spotting be right for me and my issue? And maybe it's not even trauma. Maybe it's not even addiction. Maybe it's, I have this chronic anxiety or depression. What do they do? How would they explore more, kind of make that informed decision if brain spottings would be a good fit for them? And how do they find someone? And how do they find someone like you?
Yeah, sure. Well, we've got, probably 20,000 people trained in brain spotting, I think, at this point, worldwide. Brain spotting doesn't just treat trauma, because it's going into the limbic system and processing what's there. It treats stress, and stress and trauma is a spectrum, right? So you can have like mild stress here, and then you can have, complex PTSD or dissociative identity phenomenon over here. And that's just a long spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's able to address all of those things. And, in conjunction with other tools and therapies. That's what's great about it, is it's so integrative. You can do brain spotting standalone, but Like I utilize internal family systems. I use tenets of somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, and all those different things to work with people. So I think the first thing I would recommend for someone who's curious and wanting to learn is do some research, and brainspotting.com. There's lots of YouTube videos, and people have been posting about it on their own websites. So an internet search just to learn more about it. David Grand wrote a book on brain spotting, and it's really catered to pretty much anyone. So he wrote it in a way that clients can read it and understand more. You can buy that on Amazon. I think it's like $12 US, and you can find brain spotting therapists on the brainspotting.com website. There's a directory for your location, and Psychology Today or other referral platforms, or just doing a Google search, and do a consult with someone and talk with them and see if it's a good fit. It really has to be a good fit. That attunement piece is the main thing I would want people to look for, because the techniques, yes, they're important and useful, but the attunement is really, really core to why brain spotting works. We could sit and just be there with one another, and whether there was an eye position or not, that could be healing in itself if you have the right person.
Right.
So
the right fit is so important.
Mm-hmm. And it can take a bunch of times for people to find that, especially now because therapy is being utilized so much more with all of the things that are happening in our world. It's harder to find a therapist, and there's a lot of wait lists and things, at least in the United States. And so, yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Are there any exercises or strategies that our listeners can do at home or practice on their own?
There are. I would say to do that with a grain of salt, because when we find a brain spot, it can go really deep. And so we don't want people to be dysregulated and on their own and opening up, things. And I also don't want to say that to scare people, because the truth is, all of us are brain spotting all the time. And the reason I say that is gaze spotting or gazing, eye gazing, is a really natural thing that we do. So let's say you can recall a time where you were thinking about something and you were staring off into space, quote unquote. That's a gaze spot. That's your brain is orienting with an eye position to the information that it's looking at inside. So while it can be facilitated and go very deep, we're also touching on it all the time in our day-to-day life. I would recommend, if someone is curious about it and just wants to know, oh, what is this brain spotting thing? How does it work? I would, try and think about something positive. And maybe you want to anchor positive things inside. So it's not always processing the murky stuff. It's also the whole sector of brain spotting that is about performance and enhancing into expansion beyond post-traumatic stress disorder or our problems. It's about growth. So let's say you want to be like the best basketball player in the world, and you want to be really, really good at basketball. And so you could do your own little meditative practice, because brain spotting is very meditative for most people, and imagine being on the basketball court and making every basket and making every free throw, and fans cheering you on, whatever it is that lights you up about what you're doing. And you want to get as much sensory into that as possible. So where do you notice it in your body or around your body? Who are you with? What are you, thinking about when you're in that moment, and imagining yourself being successful. And then you can scan your line of sight, from left to right or right to left, and find where you are attracted to that. The feeling inside, almost like a magnet. A lot of times people describe finding a brain spot like a magnet, and where your eyes magnetize. It's a common saying for brain spotters. And so you go across, and then it might be up or down, so you can look that way, and see. Or you might just spontaneously feel it. So if you're like thinking about something, you can just notice like where your eyes naturally just pop to, and hang out there and see what happens. And you can empower yourself with that. I remember when I was doing the job interview for the position I'm in now as the director, and I was so nervous about the interview. And so I was with my brain spotting therapist, and we had, a couple of sessions with doing the expansion work and imagining like doing this interview really well. And, it was my director spot. So I found, I named the spot. That's the director spot. I'm looking at it right now as we're talking about it. It's still like in there. And, I imagined like nailing the interview, and then I did, a week later. So it reduced my anxiety about it. And
Right. Yeah. And I love that. My specialty is mental performance and working with athletes. That's my background, coming from Minnesota and being a hockey player there and coach. But it is gaining more traction in our world, not as much still as visualizing. But as you're describing that, what came to mind was, that sounds a lot like visualization, which is a huge strategy that we use. How does it different other than one being your eyes closed and you're still activating all those senses and seeing that movie play out in your mind's eye versus that kind of eye open fixed spot? What do you think the major difference is?
Yeah. So with brain spotting, it's more than just visuals. Like you said, it can be all senses, all sensory. Some people aren't visual. And so that this shouldn't bar them if they aren't, can't imagine themselves doing whatever it is that they're wanting to focus on. So utilizing all of the senses, and the fixed eye position is where it's really the big difference, because the focal point is where it's actually located in your brain. So you might be, just visualizing something, and that has its, power. And then you might do the same thing and have a brain spot, and it's going to be like supercharged, because you're going to the exact place where it lives inside of your brain and your body. And that's where it's held. And so their neural networks can connect with one another and make it stronger and more anchored into your system. I'd say those are the main differences between those two things.
Amazing. And Mariya, where can our listeners find you?
Sure. You can find me on my website. So it's awakenconsultingservices.com. And you're welcome to shoot me a message on there. We have a lot of resources on there for all of the work that we've talked about, but also I do brain spotting trainings. So I teach phase 1, phase 2, and with one of my mentors, Dr. Robbie Aples, who's been key in a lot of the addiction knowledge that I have. We are co-training and teaching her addictions training with brain spotting as well later this year. I do somatic abolitionism, anti-racism coaching with groups and individuals. I see clients. So I'd love to hear from people. It'll be so fun.
Oh, that's awesome. That is amazing. Well, thank you. I just want to commend you for you putting in the hard work in your own story, sharing parts of that with us, and then looking at the fruit of that, of how much that's come out to help other people. You're so passionate. You're a wealth of knowledge. The different niches and areas that you work in is just mind blowing. like the education piece that you're able to describe it and put into that detail, it is so beautiful. And I think, that's fantastic when we academically know how to describe it, which you're very gifted in, but you can tell you've lived it. And that right there is really, like you said, the bread and butter. And I think that's when you connect with someone, it's that authenticity, it's the depth of it, it's like, okay, I can trust you. I've seen, I can just sense that you've walked through this. So that enhances my trust here. And I just want to thank you for doing that, because that is such important work, and probably why you're in a position of a directorship too. And thank you for coming on today. Thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom and expertise and part of your story.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much.